Nav, we'll kick things off here in about 10 seconds, so you can get yourself ready. All right. Nav is all over it. Fantastic. All right, welcome everybody to the HR Summit. This is the virtual reality segment of the particular event. Welcome to the HR Summit and our virtual reality segment. I am joined by two of my favorite people, but also two incredible professionals in Catherine Delapour and Christopher Lind. As we get things kicked off, folks, would you mind just introducing yourselves, a bit about what you do, and then we'll get things started with today's panel.
You move first, Catherine.
Thank you, Christopher. So I'm Catherine. What I do for a living is I coach leadership teams and individuals. What I leave behind really is more resilient teams. And I think a special focus for me, which is, I believe, very relevant for our conversation today, is this idea of adaptive intelligence and agile mindsets. So that's a little bit about what I do.
And I guess rather than talk about job roles or things like that, I guess the way I describe myself is I find myself at the center of business operations, technology, and then people. And so it's really kind of helping people understand, how do you move people or change behavior using technology to ultimately drive kind of a desired outcome. So I guess I kind of find myself right in the middle of that. Is that fair? Matt, you know me.
I do know you, and everyone else is going to get to know you, Christopher, over the next 40 or so minutes.
I'll allow it.
I appreciate that. And I think what's important to point out here for our audience is that we are on the stage together today, and we are in 3 different parts of the world. So, that's Catherine, true. Where do we find you today?
In London.
Beautiful London, England. And Chris?
Beautiful London.
Yeah, I'm in freezing cold Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And I'm in rainy and wet Vancouver, Canada. But through the power of virtual reality, we get to be together all on the same stage. And for those of you wondering what this experience is like, I want to spend a couple of seconds just talking through that, because it truly is a unique experience. And the 3 of us had a chance to participate in September in another HR conference, this one entirely in virtual reality, where over the course of 3 days with nearly 60 speakers and several hundred participants, we conducted panels and podcasts and keynotes and workshops entirely in virtual reality. And the first question I received from people before the conference, certainly during the conference, and then after the conference was why. And quite simply, we are now in a space where connection, collaboration, innovation has never been more important. Whether it's the global pandemic, whether it's the economic crisis, whether it's social unrest, we find ourselves in a position these days where we're seeking a greater degree of integration with one another. And aside from being face-to-face in the same physical environment, there simply is no replacement for virtual reality. We have the ability to spend time in the same space in an immersive way where we can connect and spend time together and feel, if you will, like we are in the same physical space. And it's a really important privilege that we've had, and a really important bonus that we've had in this environment. And it really is the future of not only events, but in a lot of cases, the future of enterprises. And that really is going to be the focus of today's conversation. We're going to talk about Agile. We're going to talk about enterprise applications of Agile. And we'll do so with a specific emphasis on virtual reality and immersive tech, because I think it's a real important distinction to make. And I'll set the stage by talking about the following. My experience with Agile before virtual reality was like a lot of folks. It was being at stand-up meetings in an office. It was moving Post-it notes around a Kanban board. It was whiteboarding sessions for strategic planning offsites. That was the world before COVID-19. And now as our business and our groups have had to interact in a remote, dispersed way, we've had to adapt those practices into two-dimensional linear methods of communication, whether that is Zoom or Jira or collaboration tools like Slack. And while those tools are effective insofar as bringing people together, you can't help but feel like you lose something when you translate what has traditionally been an immersive, business application into a two-dimensional method of communication. And we'll talk a bit about that. But before we go there, Catherine, as somebody who has spent much of your career supporting business leaders, supporting organizations in changing their mindset, in thinking things through differently, maybe talk to us a bit about how Agile showed up for you before 2020.
Yes, thank you for asking me that question. So the thing you need to know about me is I'm actually an anthropologist. That's my undergraduate degree. Really? So since my early 20s, I've been very, very interested in how humans adaptability. Why is it that, for thousands and thousands of years, we are the most successful species, or certainly amongst the most successful species on this planet? And yet when you compare that to some of the thinking that exists within enterprises, within corporations all over the world, there seems to be this innate fear of change. And I find that really, really interesting. Why is that? Why is it that people are frightened, are fearful of change, and yet we as human beings are built for change? We're wired for change. That's why we're so successful. So thinking about this idea of agile, I think about agile very much as it was conceived, really, as a mindset, as a set of principles. Unfortunately, the way that it's been translated in the corporate world is almost like pick and mix. I'm going to pick up this bit of agile, and it's a thing that we need to do. It's a process or something like that. But actually, it was built to change, to be used at a systems level. And for me, there's a whole conversation to be had around systems change and systems leadership. But for me, agile is kind of 4 questions, actually, when it comes to mindset. Some of us are how thinkers. That means that we're all about execution, getting stuff done. Some of us are who thinkers, so that's about connection and collaboration. Some of us are why thinkers, which is all about innovation, change, impact. And some of us are what thinkers. And we all have a natural preference into one of those 4 questions. But the adaptive mindset and agile thinking, for me, that mindset piece is the ability to be able to move into each of those 4 corners. But there's a huge challenge for corporations in terms of the assumptions, the built-in belief systems, this idea of protecting the status quo that needs to change. That's at the heart of what we need to overcome, what HR needs to overcome. Those are my initial thoughts.
We're going to have a good session today. I can already feel it. Chris,
Yeah.
I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to ask you to follow up that answer with what was Agile like for you, either in your business practice or just within your networks? What did that look like for you in 2019 and before?
So I would say 2019 and before, it really hasn't, not much. I joke about this a little bit, but it's actually kind of true. Nothing really changed for me in 2020. I mean, a few things did, but very little did. And I think it was, to your point, Catherine, I completely agree with you on this mindset thing. I think to some degree we've taken Agile and we've turned it into the actual opposite of what it was. I didn't really know what it was called when I first realized that I was kind of just operating out of that mindset. I grew up in the software world in my early career, and Agile was just kind of part of the process. It was just kind of this iterate, you try things, you experiment, they blow up, you learn, you move on. And so that just kind of was the way I operated all the time, moving forward. And so I guess that's just kind of the way I've looked at things throughout my career is how do we just keep learning and adapting and seeing what we can do. So like I said, not a whole lot changed. Actually, when 2020 hit, I remember being part of a lot of different panels and groups where people were kind of scrambling to figure out what to do. And we were kind of looking around like, well, I mean, we're going to keep doing what we were doing before. We'll probably change a few things based on what happened, but not much has shifted.
Yeah, and I think you both have made really interesting points. And I think Catherine's absolutely correct in that Agile was intended to, remove rigidity from traditional waterfall practices, whether it is in projects or in leadership style or in communication. And in doing so, we simply replicated one rigidity methodology for another.
Came up with a new framework.
Right. Like you can call it Agile, but if you treat it as waterfall, then you really just have a waterfall 2.0. And Chris, you're right insofar as I think organizations in this year, we talk a lot about what has changed. And I don't know that the business practices, like what we're actually doing in organizations has materially shifted. I think the mediums have shifted. I think the fact that we're not all co-located in the same physical space is obviously different. But while in the rush for organizations to retool their employees by providing laptops and VPN access, we didn't spend the time to think through how work is done and what behaviors and competencies would be required in this dispersed workforce. There was a sense specifically early in 2020 where it was, we need to provide technology and hardware and software to ensure business continuity with an expectation that we're going to go back to the way things were. So there really wasn't a lot of thought and investment around, okay, things need to materially shift. It's how can we cobble together something that kind of makes sense to keep the lights on. But if it's June or if it's September or if it's January 1st, 2021, we're going to go back to the way things were. Don't worry, everyone. Things will be back to normal. And I think we're now coming to a realization that that's not the case, that we're not going to go back to the way things were in 2019 and beforehand. So my question for you, and I'm going to ask you this question first, Christopher, which is, why do you think that we were so, as organizations and as leaders, why do you think we were so reluctant to actually consider the implications of Agile in the ways we go about doing the work?
Why? I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. Because if you look at what happened and what you look at what happened, none of this stuff was new. I mean, really, this was all coming for us along. This has been building for a while. I think 2020 just pushed us over the top. So I think going back to your point, Catherine, like, why did we not really want to tackle this? I think we were comfortable. There wasn't really anything forcing us to have to move. There wasn't really anything that had given us such a, and I think to your point of humans have this natural ability to change, but sometimes it takes something being put in front of us, thrust in front of us that we can't ignore to finally go, all right, now I guess that we're going to have to do it. I think the part that we're going to have to tackle now is when you really look into the psychology of it, people associate a lot of their personal identity to what they did. And I think sometimes we don't always think about, to your point, what actually is truly at the core of that. Like your identity is not built in the activities that you're doing. It's built in what are the skills and the abilities that you have, the capabilities that you have. And so I think that's what we're seeing now is kind of almost this. And I think that's one of the big things that led to people not wanting to make changes. It was like, well, this is who I am. This is how our business is, what we do. And now we're looking at it going, well, but you can't be that anymore. You can't. So you have to change. And so people they're getting there. I think we're getting along the way. But now we have this almost psychological crisis, which I think we're seeing now with suicide rates and things where people are starting to go, but does that mean I'm no longer me? And I think this is where we can start to work towards how do we people understand that at the core, it's still you, it's still your business, it's still everything about that. You're just doing it differently, and your identity was never attached to that anyway.
Which is
very true.
So many great points there. And it allows me, thank you, by the way, for setting this up, Christopher, because this allows me to get right into the question that I was looking forward to asking Catherine, which is a lot of the resistance, I believe, and as you pointed out, Christopher, is that it comes back to individual leaders and this sense of loss or this sense of fear around how am I going to show up in a world that is different, in a world where the skills that I have leveraged and the tools in my tool bag, if you will, that got me to this point have suddenly been rendered less useful if I make a change. And Catherine, I mean, that is your practice. You're working with leaders who are going through significant amounts of change from a number of factors, both macroeconomic, but certainly in a more micro sense as well. So, and we're talking to an audience today of several thousand HR leaders that are very much at the intersection of innovation in organizations and seeking to retool and inspire their leaders and their organizations to make these necessary steps going forward. For those individuals that are working with those executives and with those business leaders, how do we begin this conversation in a way that is recognizes where we've come from and recognizes the fact that there is a lot of good in where we've come from, but that ultimately we need to make a fundamental shift in where we're going at the individual leadership level? How do we broach that conversation, and how do we set those people up for a degree of success that lends itself to the pace of change that we're going to need to realize if we are to do this right?
Great question. Very meaty. I think do you know what? It ultimately, on a one-to-one basis, it goes to what Christopher has already said around identity. Who am I? Who am I? And in fact, a lot of the coaching sessions that I run with leaders and leadership groups start with the question or start with the statement, I am ... Okay, fill out that page. So we all have beliefs about ourselves. Some of those beliefs are positive, some of those beliefs are not so positive. I think it's worth introducing this idea now, which is, I think, at the absolute center of why some people are able to change and some people are unable to change, which is about emotional self-awareness and emotional intelligence. So I've seen a gazillion articles at the moment talking about why adaptive intelligence is probably the number one skill for the 21st century. And to your point about Agile, why did Agile come about? It came about because there was far less predictability. There was a lot of complexity. So Agile was there to aid the move towards simplicity as much as anything else. And of course, speed, the ability to move really, really fast. But let's put this into context. But historically, we've moved from a system within the last 100 years where we had a manufacturing base, where we had lines of management, where we had bureaucracy, where there was a really clear hierarchy, where there were clear lines of power, and you didn't step outside of that line. And so what we're asking leaders to do, and there are people who are CEOs today, they're in the C-suite, who grew up with those hierarchies. And so all of their role models and all of the beliefs that they've imbibed, all of the mantras, all of the mottos that they have absorbed over their career has been based around power and control. I mean, that's just for starters. And we're asking those people where they have been set up within a certain system which ultimately has its roots in manufacturing, to move to the other side of the model. So to move away from, to give up power and control, because it's all about empowerment now. And that's a very different set of skills. And it's also, to Christopher's earlier point, about a very different identity. And that is a belief about, I am someone who is likable, lovable. I am somebody who can build trusted relationships. I am somebody who is able to connect and in meaningful ways and collaborate with other people. And I am somebody who can put myself in the shoes of others, which is the empathy piece. This is diametrically opposed to where many, many leaders are at the moment in their heads, which is their identity is stacked against, I'm a risk taker, I'm confident. So these are diametrically opposed drivers. So you're, on the one hand, you've got a belief system that is set in outputs and achievement, and let's go close a deal, let's go and, you know, perform at our very best, push, power and control. I'm going up the greasy pole. And on the other hand, you have got a new set of circumstances, a new environment, where, as you said, Matt, that's not relevant anymore. And somebody very wise said something to me, which is, true confidence is trusting in abundance. And that's what we're asking our leaders to do. But it's not something you can do overnight.
No, it really isn't. And it's something that we have to reconcile, though, inside of organizations from every angle in the organization if we're going to make this change, because in a lot of ways we're fighting against inertia. And that's something we have to recognize as we consider this path forward. Now, Catherine and Christopher, you guys both know from September that one of the big benefits of being in this particular medium, virtual reality, is that we get a degree of interactivity between ourselves here, but also with our audience, to engage in a way where it feels like we're in the same physical space. And for those who are in the audience with us today, I want to encourage you, if you do have questions that you want to ask anyone here on the panel, feel free to do that. We'll create some space for you as we get to the end of this session to be able to interact with us, because that's something that we so value, and something that I frankly miss a lot from the traditional conference circuit. You know, when we have these new two-dimensional mechanisms of communication, whether it's Zoom or Hopin, they're great. They've come such a long way in a short period of time out of necessity. And there's still a gap between what they afford you in terms of interactivity and collaboration and connection to being physically in the same space. So, and one of those things is the opportunity for us to interact and engage in a more personal and intimate way. So for those in the audience, if you do have a question, give that some consideration. And while you're giving some thought, we do have a question. So Onder, go ahead, ask your question.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's great. We heard lots of very good ideas and thoughts about Agile, and especially about COVID. So my question is, we are also in a transformation, Agile transformation in our group, in Koç Holding. It's a very big conglomerate from Turkey. So my question is, before COVID, before this crisis, the Agile transformation, the biggest challenge about Agile transformation is the mid-level managers, actually, because we need to change their mindset in order to actually adapt to Agile. Let's say, to be Agile, we need to actually change the mindset of especially the mid-level managers. And with COVID and with remote working, let's say remote working, the mid-level managers actually have a very big crisis, because the things that the things that you did in the past, it's not working in remote working environments. So what do you think about that? How do you think, how will we affect especially the mid-level managers in the next 3 to 5 years? Because most probably we are talking in our group also, that will be permanent. The remote working will be permanent, not maybe 5 days per week, but 2 days, 3 days per week. It will be permanent. How will we deal with that? Thank you very much, by the way.
You're welcome. Who wants to tackle that question?
So I'll jump first on it because I have, when it comes to this remote work thing, I get it's a topic I like to talk about, but I'll try and do it quickly, Catherine, so you can add some things to it. I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is something I've been talking to a lot of organizations about, and it relates to mid-level managers, it relates to frontline employees, it relates to a lot of things, is that there were a lot of assumptions we were making about things that were working pre-COVID or pre-remote work that actually weren't really working that well. And what COVID did is it just vastly exposed the fact that they weren't working. Suddenly we saw it just on, it was just amplified. So like with our mid-level managers, and I see this all the time, there was a lot of, they knew how to get things done. And I put that in air quote. I can't do that with my hands, but in that they kind of were getting along and kind of taking for granted the fact that people were there so they could kind of make things happen. And then, but it really wasn't working that well. If we're honest about it, at least in every instance I've seen, it really wasn't working that well. It's just now it's that much harder, and the intentionality that has to go behind it. Now, that's not to say, it's an easy fix, because the problem was we had a problem we had to fix before. We just didn't realize how big of a problem it was. So in terms of those mid-level managers, the skills of all the things you talked about, Catherine, in terms of, hey, it's not about command and control. This is how we actually now operate as leaders. This is how you inspire and influence your people. That skill set and mindset, we've got to reskill and upskill that now. So next 3 to 5 years, we've got to hit at the core of it. And I think that's where a lot of organizations focus just on, how do we get these managers to use Teams or Slack or Zoom? And it's like, well, but if we don't address the core problem, which was they really weren't leading that well and weren't really aligned to these behaviors we needed to be, even when they come back, or if they come back, we're still going to have the same problem. It might just be masked. So I think a lot of the orgs I work with or talk to now, I'm like, let's get to the bottom of what are these core behaviors that are missing in our mid-level managers, and how do we identify them? How do we work on them? And how do we find the champions? Because we didn't hit on this before, but a lot of times I think people are afraid to make these shifts because they don't really know what it looks like on the other side. And it feels big and scary and overwhelming. And if you can find those people that can make those changes and do it and lead it, people will start to come along. Look at that video you see online of that weird person just kind of dancing on their own. And then all of a sudden everybody comes and does it. So I think that's kind of my take on it. Catherine?
Yeah. No, I love that idea, Christopher, of change champions. And actually, I think if there's one thing that COVID, one of the things I've said to a lot of my clients is, during COVID, keep your eyes wide open for your rising stars. And these may not be people that you have typically focused on before, but they are the people who have been able to roll up their sleeves, they've got a can-do attitude, and they have stepped up, and they have stepped forward. But I think for me, thinking about my coach training, a couple of things that I can offer. One is that what is the role of manager? That's a good question, I think. And getting really clear on what do you actually want your managers to do. Netflix, how Netflix reinvented HR, a very famous deck that went around Silicon Valley, talks about how Netflix saw management or the role of manager. And that was very much as their job, their primary role was to build great teams. And that's differentiated from what the leader's role is, right? Which is building culture, owning the culture piece. So if we assume that the role of great managers is to build great teams. And I think what's really interesting around the agile piece is that there's been this shift away from individual performance to a much greater emphasis now on team performance. And I've seen this shift in terms of my work. So whereas primarily I was doing a lot of one-to-one coaching, I'm now doing a lot more team coaching to start with. But coming back to your question, I think understanding how humans actually work, what is the motivation of a human? Why does a human get up in the morning? Or why don't they get up in the morning? Because some of them don't, do they? They stay in bed. Actually understanding what's called intrinsic motivation is a really, really good place to start. And there's a fabulous book by Dan Pink called Drive. And if you could give that book to every single one of your managers, that is the start of a really, really great conversation. Because to Christopher's point about the assumptions that we make, there's a huge assumption based on a lot of old psychology and old psychological models around carrot and stick, for example. You know, if you beat somebody hard enough, then they might just do the job you want them to do. That's not actually how humans work. We you know, and this is the work that I do around the EQ piece, around emotional needs, the need for safety and belonging, the need for purpose, the need for relationships. That's what's going to get your people fired up. And I think the second thing that I would offer you is, in terms of management, is get your managers trained up in basic coaching skills. I think that's 101 manager training now, coaching. So asking great questions rather than the tell, because telling has been the mode of operation of most leaders, managers, supervisors for the last 100 years, and it's not working anymore.
I knew we would do this. I knew we would get into a conversation that I wanted to go on for several hours, but we're going to run short on time. So thank you both for validating that belief. I want to address something very quickly that each of you have said, and then I want to open things up to our very last question before I wrap up today's session. So for each of you, Catherine, we have had several conversations about the link between intrinsic motivation, discretionary effort in a knowledge-based economy. And if you go back to the way work was done before, if we look at this, the industrial age, the proverbial assembly line, and the measuring of productivity in terms of how many widgets we create on an assembly line, having direct oversight of your employees and being able to say, well, Matt made 117 widgets and Catherine made 119 widgets. Catherine's clearly the more productive and therefore valuable employee, was an easy leap to make. And management in that dynamic was providing enough pressure on those two employees so that the next day they could increase their numbers and ultimately deliver more of an output. The model of employment was very exploitative in that sense. Employees were employed to achieve a very specific outcome, and the outcome was very tangible, and their self-actualization, their engagement really wasn't relevant. In fact, if it happened, great, and if it didn't, we would find somebody else who could achieve the outcome we wanted to realize as an organization. We have now shifted into a knowledge-based economy. And to Chris's point, a lot of the challenges that we're faced with now that our communication mediums have shifted, they predated these COVID-19 challenges. We leaned a lot on informal methods of communication, the proverbial water cooler, the hallway conversation, the chat in the coffee line, to close up gaps that existed because we really weren't running our businesses all that effectively. And I've had the privilege of working in and working for and supporting several Fortune 1000 companies. And it is startling the lack of leadership acumen, even in the most successful companies on the planet, because they're so focused on the result, they don't spend a lot of time focusing on how they achieve the result. So basic leadership skills around supervision and follow-up and checking in on your employees are lacking. Like they're lacking because they haven't been reinforced, they haven't been seen as valuable, and we the all-stars of yesteryear were people who could transcend their terrible circumstances and still deliver a result. We're now moving to a space where we're in a knowledge-based economy, and that connection between intrinsic motivation, discretionary effort, and ultimately their output is so much less tangible. And when we look at things like resilience and learning agility and emotional intelligence, you can't see that visibly when I look at Chris or when I look at Catherine. All I know is the way the people around them feel and how the team performs and ultimately what goals they're able to accomplish in light of the circumstances that they find themselves in. So I think, Ander, to your earlier question, it's a nuance and there's layers to it. But I think the first piece is accepting that we're not operating the way things used to be, and to stop romanticizing the way things were, because they weren't all that great. But ultimately, it goes back to basics. Do we have clarity around the goals in the organization at the organizational level, at the divisional level, at the team level, and then at the individual contributor level? Do we have clarity around that? Most organizations today do not, period. So if we assume that's in place, then do we have the leaders in that framework to help us achieve those results within the organization? Whether it's waterfall or agile or digital transformation or immersive technologies, these are all mechanisms and mediums to achieve a very basic set of outcomes. So we're just talking about how we go about doing the work, but the work still has to be done. So I think for those mid-level leaders, it's asking ourselves is, do we have clarity within the organization on where we're going and their role in achieving that outcome? And if you don't have that, then everything else we're talking about is frankly, it's wasted breath. It's completely pointless. So do the mid-level managers have clarity from the senior leaders as to what is happening and what their roles in are achieving that? And have they provide that same clarity to the people within their organizations to have success? And if they haven't, fill that gap. And if they can't, fill that gap. And then from there, then talk about tools and laptops and VPNs and agile methodologies and workshops. Because, Catherine's point is well taken. A very basic course around coaching goes a long way when you've never received a minute of leadership development. And now you find yourself in a director or a vice president role for a company that's in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, which, by the way, is not uncommon. So as we wrap today's session, I want to be mindful of time, and I want to thank each of you again for giving some of your time to us today. We've talked a little bit around immersive technology, but I'm going to ask each of you to give me a very quick 30 to 60-second answer on this. Agile is a topic that has kind of permeated throughout this conversation. It's a way of working. It's a shift from waterfall into a more iterative. Catherine, you mentioned the word speed. I had a mentor who would say, Matt, give me your 80% of your best effort, but give it to me fast. We need to iterate. We need to be able to move quickly in this current environment where things aren't as static and the things are going to shift. What role do you see immersive technology like virtual reality playing in an agile context going forward? And I'm going to keep that question really open-ended because I think each of you can bring something special to that answer. So, Christopher, with you first, what role do you see in immersive technology playing in an agile environment going forward?
So when I look at it, when you think about learning and really what goes back to this mindset of agile, it's all about being able to experiment, fail, learn or unlearn, depending on what happened, and then move forward and keep doing that. Now, in the real world, that can carry some real risks. And if we're honest, there are certain things that without immersive tech, it's like, it's not safe for us to do that, or it's just not practical, or it's not scalable to do that. And so we've been operating under a lot of rules of like, well, we can't, or I can't do this. Versus, I think immersive tech took all those rules, put them in a box, and threw them in a bonfire, right? It was just like, well, those rules are gone now. So this whole idea of learning through agile with immersive tech, where it can be an enabler of that, is you can say, well, what are we trying to test? What are we trying to see? What are we trying to play with? And let's do it. And we don't have to have barriers or rules or say, well, this is a limiting factor. We can just say, let's go. Nobody's going to get hurt. Nothing's going to blow up. Let's practice this. Let's do this. And then let's learn from it, unlearn, and then let's move forward. So I think that's where it's completely erased many of the rules we've had to operate under.
Love that answer. Catherine, I was worried that you were scared of my question, that you'd fleed us.
She just ran.
returning.
She's like, I'm out of here.
She just go, I don't want. I'm not. I don't want this question.
I pressed the wrong button. Sorry.
Now that you're back and you're trapped, same question to you. What role do you see with immersive technologies and playing in an agile context going forward?
Do you know what? I think the thing that comes to mind is one of the values, which is people before process. And look, there's the entire planet right now is trapped in a bedroom somewhere, maybe, or a room, or a family home, or trapped. I'm being slightly lighthearted about this, but I think if people really matter to organizations, if that mantra of people before process can be lived, then I think technologies, virtual reality, is the opportunity to unlock that people before process, because you can be anywhere in the world. You can literally port yourself. Think about it. A CEO of a business can port themselves to anywhere in the world to be with whatever team they want to be with, whatever part of the business they want to see. And it's literally at the touch of a button. So in terms of walking the floor, virtual reality is like walking the floor on steroids.
Yep.
Again, you've both made incredible points, and I'm going to wrap things up by answering a question that I get most often. So with my work with Bento HR, organizations lean on us to help them bridge the gap between where they are and where they're going, often through technology. And in the context of immersive technology, I want to be very clear about this point. Virtual reality is not the solution to all of the world's problems.
No,
it's not. However, if you are looking for a complementary communication medium, a complementary collaboration medium, or a complementary knowledge transfer learning medium, this is the tool for you. And it will work alongside being in the same physical space in offices when we can all do that. It will work alongside collaboration tools like Slack, web conference tools like Zoom, phone calls, emails, instant messaging. They will all carry on in this new world that we live in. But if you're looking for a more intimate method to connect with somebody in a face-to-face way, recruitment, performance management, learning and development, team collaboration, there simply isn't anything better than virtual reality other than being in the same room. And Catherine, you've hit on the key point, and Chris mentioned this earlier as well, which is that we had constraints before COVID-19 around geography, around cost, around certain people had encumbrances to be in the same room. I spent many years on the road in operational roles where I would be off-site and dialing into meetings, and being the one person on a conference call in a room full of 40 people at the home office is a very horrible experience. With this technology, I can now be completely connected to my teams whenever I need to be. And then when I need to be disconnected, I can also be. So this technology is really the bridge between the virtual and the physical worlds, and provides that tether that you would need to have those connections, to have those conversations. And we hope that today's conversation provided that bridge for you, that showed you the power of this particular medium to communicate and to give you something that you've seen in the physical sense before, but that you're now consuming in a digital context. And when we do this again, and we absolutely will do this again, we would encourage you to consider virtual realities being the medium in which you consume this information, that you can be with us right now in the same physical space, that we can connect and collaborate and share information and learn from each other in service to helping each other. Because if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that there's a lot of help that's needed, and we have the right people, and now we finally have the right technology to make that happen. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today from wherever you are. I hope that you've enjoyed the conference in this segment. And again, a big special thanks to our audience, Catherine, Chris. We'll be in touch very soon, folks. Thank you. All right. What a great session.
Yeah. No, thanks for including me in it. It's fun.
So
we
now
just got to
we
make
can
sure
wrap things
people
up.
we just got to make sure people do VR right, so we don't end up with VR fatigue like we do with Zoom, where everybody just jumps from one boat into the next, right? Like, oh,
That's
everything's
true.
VR.
So Chris, I know you got to run. It's 58. I'll let you get out of here
Yeah,
if you need to get out of
like
here.
I said, I can be a couple minutes late, so I can just kind of chill for a little bit.
You're way more casual with your time than I am.
You know.
Oh,
Thanks, Nav. Appreciate it.
you.